All right. Hello, everybody. Now, Sellars says early in Language, Rules, and Behavior, to say that man is a rational animal is to say that man is a creature not of habits, but of rules. Maybe you remember the way that passage goes on. When God created Adam, he whispered in his ear, "In all contexts of action, you will recognize rules. When you cease to recognize rules, you will walk on 4 feet." So I hope that's recognizable as signing on to the Kantian normative revolution that I talked about last time, which is the main move in Sellars' attempt to usher analytic philosophy from its Humean to its Kantian phase. As you remember, he described what he hoped the effect of his work would be. But there's more involved in that phrase than maybe meets the eye. The invocation of habits in particular. This essay from 1949 appears in a Festschrift for John Dewey. And as form required, Sellars took it that it was part of his task in such an essay to connect his work with American pragmatism and say something about his relation to pragmatism. Now, I started off last time saying that I think of Sellars as the greatest and most important American philosopher since Charles Sanders Peirce. The invocation of habits, by contrast to rules here, is a direct reference to Peirce. It's throwing down a gauntlet. It's challenging him because the central idea of Peirce's pragmatism is that of habits. I talked last time about some of Kant's big organizing ideas. This is the big organizing idea of Peirce's pragmatism. I think with the wisdom of hindsight, we can see that what was special about understanding everything in terms of habits, as Peirce did, is that the concept of habit essentially incorporates subjunctive conditionals, codifying dispositions. To talk about habits is to talk about what someone would do if they were put in a certain kind of situation. And Peirce is very clear that he focuses on this notion because he sees it as of the essence of natural science. One of his early index examples is talking about the concept of fragility, the idea that something would break if it were struck. And one of his examples, thought experiments, is a diamond that's formed in the heart of a volcano and then burns up without ever being struck by anything that would shatter it. And he asks, is it still fragile? Was it fragile when it existed? And he says, yes, because to say that it's fragile is not to talk about what it actually did, but to talk about its habits. What would have happened if it had been struck? I think here of Thomas Gray and the Elegy in a Country Churchyard. He says, "Many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bear. Full many a flower is born to bloom unseen and waste its sweetness in the desert air." He's thinking about all these unobserved things. He says they still have all their habits. The fact that nothing triggered the fragility into an actual breaking doesn't mean it didn't have that fragility. So, I think this is not often appreciated about Peirce's pragmatism, that at its core is the idea of building alethic modal concepts in as primitives that he's going to allow himself to appeal to in the form of the notion of habits. And in this way, he saw himself correctly as decisively breaking with the Humean empiricism that was dominant in his day and is by no means absent in our own, because it was the essence of Hume's empiricist skepticism to question the empiricist credentials of appeals to laws that underwrite subjunctive conditionals. He says, look, I know what it is for the cat to be on the mat, but I don't know what it is to say that the cat would run away if a dog came into the room. This is the essence of the pragmatist revolution. It's naturalist ontology that treats modal properties as primitives. I think this is important because Anglophone analytic philosophy didn't recover this sort of view until the Kripkean modal revolution against Quine in the late 60s and early 70s. It was already there in pragmatism. It got lost. Epistemologically, pragmatism could reconstrue cognition and agency in terms of habits. And crucially, Peirce saw habits as evolving selectionally in learning at the individual level, where some habits are reinforced and persist and other habits are discouraged and evanesce. But he saw these selectional processes of winnowing habits to make some of them more robust and others of them less as common to learning at the individual level and to evolution at a biological level. Sellars seconds this in some reflections on language games, where he says the phenomenon of learning presents interesting analogies to the evolution of species. He's just picking up this Peircean idea. And for Peirce, it was important because in this way, the master concept of habits and the idea that they're selected in environments through learning or through evolution gave him a way of erasing any bright line between human knowers and agents on the one hand, and not just the better looking sorts of animals, merely sentient but not sapient ones, who also can be understood in terms of habits and learning with evolution in the background. But in ontology, Peirce wanted to understand physics in that way. Instead of seeing laws of nature as exceptionless, eternal generalizations, he saw them as habits and thought of them as having evolved in the context of other physical habits of objects, so that what is law-like for us is just the habits of things that turned out to be particularly persistent. So the naturalist ontology came with a naturalist epistemology. He could understand order as arising statistically from the selection of some habits in the context of an environment of other habits. Yeah.
This is something that always puzzled me about the sort of habit stuff, because is this operating under the assumption that at one point, is this an empirical question in part? There weren't these regularities and they did evolve, in fact, to become, were electrons not always doing the things that they do now and they came to?
Yep.
This is other commitments. I'm assuming certain things clearly about physics and the objects. But,
yeah. Peirce actually talks about this a lot and says, look, we don't know. We don't know about phases of the universe before our laws were in place. But he thinks it's important that we think of it that way. It is, he does mean it inter alia as an empirical hypothesis. And of course, it's actually something that in contemporary cosmology people are taking seriously, the idea that these things change. It turns out that the constancy of the fundamental symmetries of time are equivalent to the conservation of energy. So it's a big hypothesis there. But he says, it's important that we be open to think about it, to thinking about it this way. But you can see Sellars opening his essay by saying, no, we are not creatures of habits. We're creatures of rules. He's saying, no, I'm disagreeing with Peirce and American pragmatism downstream from that. Our master concept should not be the alethic modal concept of habits and dispositions. It should be the normative concept of rules. So I think that's the first thing to understand here. Peirce had a way of integrating knowers into the world under the rubric of habits. There's a danger of that being lost unless Sellars can tell a story about how norms fit into the world. So, thank you. Here's a quick reminder. Last time I talked about Kant's revolutionary redescription of the distinction between us and it, between discursive sapient creatures and merely sentient organic ones, apperceivers versus perceivers, together with organic and inorganic inanimate nature. Kant redescribes, reconstrues us in normative terms of commitments, authority, responsibility, seeing us above all as creatures who live and move and have our being in a domain of commitments. And I mentioned how this understanding of us as normative creatures is taken up by the German neo-Kantians in the second half of the 19th century as a way of distinguishing what philosophers do from what empirical scientists do. They took Kant's distinction between quid juris, the question of the rule, from the quid facti, the question of the fact, that is, the notion of justification, as opposed to the notion of causal origins or mechanisms, in drawing the contrast between what he was doing, asking about the validity of our claims, as opposed to what the celebrated Mr. Locke was offering, a mere physiology of the understanding, an account of the mechanisms of belief formation. And in the eyes of these German neo-Kantians, they were just picking up on the distinction that Plato's Socrates made between what philosophers do and what sophists do. The sophists who were concerned with mechanisms of inducing belief, ways of getting people to believe what you wanted to, whereas the philosophers were concerned with this peculiar force of the better reason, which you could see above all in its purest form in geometrical arguments. But that was puzzling in that this force of the better reason was not compulsory. It didn't necessarily mean that people responded to the force of the better reason. We can say now, well, this was a normative force, but it's what puzzled and fascinated the ancient Greeks. Now, the figure who maybe matters most to us philosophically in the second half of the 19th century isn't one of these neo-Kantians, but in Germany it's Frege, founder of modern logic. He didn't think of himself as a neo-Kantian, though he was taught by Kuno Fischer, the Kantian scholar who initiated this movement. And his colleague and best friend in Jena was Bruno Bauch, who was a student of the neo-Kantian Heinrich Rickert. But he didn't think of himself as a neo-Kantian. Nonetheless, at the center of his philosophy of logic was an opposition between his view and what he called psychologism, and saw as the dominant view of other logicians of his time. They thought of logic as studying thought processes, the way people actually reason. And this, of course, was something that was threatened by the work that was being done in the physiology and psychology laboratories, the next building over in the German university. And Frege said, no, logic is like ethics, a normative science. It's not a matter of how people do reason, but how they ought to reason. How it's correct for them to reason. So under the heading of psychologism, he's absolutely taking on board this Kantian normative evolution of peace with the German Kantians. Yes.
I'm finding a sort of tension between the way you're expounding Sellars' law and the language rules and behavior paper. So maybe you can help me correct it. So I mean, the way he starts off the paper, he says he wants to offer, he says philosophically oriented, but a philosophically oriented behavioristic psychology, these evaluative terms. And when we get the claims about the significance of rules in understanding human behavior, we get the passage that you quoted about a man is a creature of rules, not habits. Right after that, he wants to distance himself from rationalistic a priorism. He says animal learning theory provides all the keys to psychological phenomena, stuff like this. Is that orientation he's taking towards the claims he's making makes it difficult for me to understand how this idea that he's sort of leaving behind the Humean phase and moving over into a Kantian phase. I feel like he seems like he's conceding what he's doing in a different way.
The talk about behaviorism, the talk about animal learning theory, and so on, seems to put him on the other side. Yeah, I mean, I think this is important. You're absolutely right to discern this. It's his commitment to not letting the distinction between the normative and the factual, empirical turn into a dualism. He's committed to finding his norms in nature, writ large, at least. We'll see later on that he makes a distinction between what's real, what's in the world in a narrow sense, which does not include norms, but what's real and in the world in a wider sense that does. He's less clear about that here, but in some reflections on language games, he's going to give us an account of norms implicit in practices, norms that are lived rather than described. So there is a tension that he's aware of, and he's committed to resolving it. In language rules and behavior, he doesn't do more than gesture at how he might do that, but he's laying down a marker here that accepting us as creatures of rules is not going to require us to think of us as not part of nature. So Frege described logic as a normative science and said you must not psychologize it. Stanley Cavell, in a characteristically trenchant aphorism, said, picking up on this Fregean phrase, that Kant de-psychologized epistemology. Frege de-psychologized logic, and Wittgenstein de-psychologized psychology. So for Kant, epistemology, study of the justification, de-psychologizing by contrast to Locke, who is the psychologizing epistemologist, doesn't see the difference. Frege seeing logic as the science of good reasoning, not of actual thought processes, depsychologizing logic. And Wittgenstein depsychologizing, well, intentionality, belief, desire, intention, pain, these psychological states. I want to say Sellars depsychologized psychology too, in that sense. Now, the reason I'm talking about this background, the charge of psychologism is specifically addressed to failures to appreciate Kant's revolutionary recentering of the philosophical study of human discursive activity on the normative dimension. The form of thought that Sellars opposes, he calls descriptivism. So he's an anti-descriptivist rather than anti-psychologist, objecting to descriptivism rather than psychologism. And that's a broader category. It includes, descriptivism includes failing to appreciate normativity, what's expressed by normative vocabulary, talk about rules, talk about norms, but he also thinks that people can be descriptivists about alethic modal vocabulary of subjunctively, what's expressed by subjunctively robust conditionals, thought of dispositions. He says, and this is the passage you were just mentioning, I'll attempt to map a true via media between a rationalistic a priorism and what I shall call descriptivism, by which I mean the claim that all meaningful concepts and problems belong to empirical or descriptive sciences, including the sciences of human behavior. Now, I'll talk later on about what he means by that rationalistic a priorism. That's really what he's addressing in the opening paragraphs of some reflections on language games, sort of paradoxical understanding of rules as something that we're immediately aware of. Now, if you remember the diagram, that's just so you remember it, one of the divisions between left and right, the wings, the sides of the diagram, has the label anti-descriptivism on the space of reasons, non-naturalism side, and the scientia mensura slogan on the right-hand side, on the naturalism, the scientific naturalism side. Anti-descriptivism is the polar opposite of the scientia mensura on the face of it. But remember how the scientia mensura begins. It says, in the dimension of describing and explaining, science is the measure of all things. Anti-descriptivism is saying, yeah, and there's lots of other things we do besides describing. So in fact, these are not in tension. They're two sides of one coin articulating a more nuanced view than the idea that you need to pick between the left wing and the right wing suggests. So in an essay that we'll read later on, the counterfactualist dispositions and the causal modalities, Sellars says, once the tautology, the world is described by descriptive concepts, is freed from, so it's a tautology. What you should do with tautologies is believe them. People often forget a sort of converse of that. I think of it as Belknap's principle, my colleague Newell Belknap, who says, I have a firm policy about incredible claims. I don't believe them. What you should do with tautologies is believe them. What you should do with incredible claims is not believe them. Once the tautology, the world is described by descriptive concepts, is freed from the idea that the business of all non-logical concepts is to describe, the way is clear to an ungrudging recognition that many expressions which empiricists have relegated to second-class status are not inferior. They're just different. They're doing something other than describing. So here he's pointing to a really fundamental fork in the philosophical methodological road. And it has to do with how you think about, how you divide the labor between your account of talking and your account of the world. And what he's calling descriptivism has a unified monistic account of what language does, that sees it as having a core function and puts all the multifarious variations into its ontology or its metaphysics, to the stuff you're talking about. I mean, that core function, at least since Descartes, has been representation, fact stating, describing how the world is, representing things, picturing how the world is a version of this. And the paradigm is, in principle, observable statements about middle-sized bits of dry goods, in Austin's phrase. You know, the frog is on the log, the chickens are in the barn. And the thought is that sort of fact stating, that's the core function of language. But when you start to think about other forms of language, I mean, this descriptive picture took the form in the early modern period of a notion of judgment as classification, taking some particular as falling under a universal or one universal to be included in another. And Kant said about that, well, what about hypothetical statements, conditionals? What are they, if I say, if the moon is made of green cheese, there must be space cows. What have I been classifying in there? This descriptivism, taking the core function of language to be stating facts, describing things as they are, led Russell in the teens, in his logical atomist period, to postulate negative facts and conditional facts and quantificational facts, and then have to do some metaphysical heavy lifting in order to say what kinds of things these were. One of the reasons empiricists like Quine are skeptical about modality is they couldn't imagine what modal facts were like. Quine says, you're telling me that it's not, though it's not true, it's possible that we can't leave the room because there's a fat man stuck in the doorway. He said, tell me about that fat man. You know, is he bald? That possible fat man stuck in the doorway. What are these mere possibilities? And we've seen, well, it's a real question what normative facts would look like, what the fact that I ought not torture the helpless wanderer, what does that ought not consist in? But probabilistic facts, intentional facts about what somebody wants or believes, semantic facts about what some expression means, mathematical facts, what kind of a fact is it that 2 + 2 is 4? What about facts about universals, that triangularity is a property? Aesthetic facts. If you say the core function of language is description, fact stating, representation of how things are, you've got a unified account of the language, but at the cost of putting all the variety, all the multifarious aspects of our talk into your ontology, into your metaphysics. That's a profusion that Quine, expressing his nominalist tendencies, said, well, he had a taste for desert landscapes. He didn't want to engage in ontological indulgences of just postulating whatever kinds of weird entities you needed to in order to make sense of these things. And it's not just ontological weirdness. Postulating these things brings with it serious epistemological difficulties. How is it that we engage cognitively with these weird kinds of facts, with facts about abstract objects like numbers, with normative facts, if they don't exert physical forces, the meanings of statements, how do we know about them?
So the quote you brought about the inferiority of non-descriptive expressions was looks like 10 years after the LRB was written. Would the Sellars of LRB have characterized descriptivists as missing out on metalinguistic expressions?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the advent of concern with metalinguistic expressions is a move Sellars had already made. It's one I'll get to in a minute in describing the progress of anti-descriptivism in 20th century philosophy, but it's an important move. So, from Sellars' point of view, you buy the unified account of language that sees a core function of language as being fact-stating, representing, describing. I mean, there are subtle differences among all of those, but for this point and for now, we can run them together. There's the ontological weirdness of them. J.L. Mackie famously talked about the metaphysical queerness of norms or values and considered that an objection to moral realism. So there's metaphysical challenges, and there's serious epistemological challenges in talking about how we come to know these things. If, as seems to be, they're not mentioned in the physicist's inventory of the furniture of the world, how do we come by these things? The rationalist a priorism that he said was the sort of the other side that he wanted to avoid says, oh, well, we have special intuitive abilities. We're immediately aware of all of these kinds of things in a way that's completely different from the way we're aware of the chickens being in the barn. So, well, that isn't going to do either. Well, anti-descriptivism is the alternative that he's going to push, that says, put the multifariousness and variety on the side of the language, not on the side of the world. Instead of having this profusion of kinds of facts that are stated, of properties that you can describe things as having, think about us being able to do many other things with language besides describe things. Don't force your understanding of what we're doing when we assess what somebody did as incorrect. Don't automatically force that into the model of saying that the frog is on the log. You trade a multiplicity of metaphysical kinds of things that goes with a satisfying unity, a monism on the side of language, for a multiplicity of functions of language in your pragmatics, your account of the use of the language. Open up, don't assimilate everything to description. ungrudgingly recognize that there are other uses of language. You can still acknowledge that declarative sentences as such have something in common, and that there is a weak sense in which their truth evaluable. And so, since, as Frege says, a fact is a thought, a thinkable, a statement that's true, that there are facts, but that's not in a metaphysically oomphy sense. You're going to have to give a different declarativist account of that grammatical form, why doing these other things like making a normative assessment can be expressed with a declarative sentence, but you don't just assume that the job of every declarative sentence is to describe how things are. Now, I think it is worth briefly rehearsing the development of this thought, this anti-descriptivist thought in the 20th century. A huge episode in it was the Tractatus. Because the Tractatus is, in a sense, the purest form, the most crystalline form of descriptivism. It says the core function of language, all you can do with language is picture the facts. Arrange name objects into language facts which picture worldly facts. Had a clear account of description or representation as picturing. That was one of the achievements of it. But a second achievement of it was a clear break with the Russellian logical atomism of the teens. I think of the Tractatus as sort of defining the 20s. He wrote it in 18 and 19, but it came out in the 20s. That's when people read it. A clean break with the logical atomism of the teens by giving a non-descriptive, non-picturing account of the distinctive expressive function of logical vocabulary. He says logical vocabulary doesn't work the way picturing vocabulary works. It doesn't picture anything. Its job is to put simple pictures together into complex pictures. And we should understand those complex pictures, well, in a truth-functional way, but all the things that are pictured are still ultimately elementary facts. We don't need to think of there being conditional facts or negative facts in order to understand the complex pictures that we can build out of basic sentences by using conditionals and negations. Now, it was this anti-descriptivism about logic that so impressed the Vienna Circle. They said, we can understand logic without metaphysical excess. We don't need to think that there are these weird, non-empirical, non-natural kinds of logical facts in order to do logic and to take that seriously in articulating scientific theories. Now, one clear path from the early Wittgenstein of the Tractatus to the later Wittgenstein is to see him as having generalized his anti-descriptivism from logical vocabulary to basically all vocabulary. He says, don't assume that just because something is expressed in a declarative sentence, that the job it's playing, that the function it's performing is stating a fact or describing something. He famously says in the Investigations that language does not have a downtown. It's all suburbs and sprawl. The descriptive representational function of language is not the center around which everything revolves, as the Tractarian picture had been. And you can see how Wittgenstein's fan, J.L. Austin, as taking up and running with this idea that describing or fact stating is not the only thing you can do with words. Ironically, given his reputation, Austin thought the right thing to do, by contrast to what Wittgenstein thought, was to get a systematic theory of the things you could do with words. He's not usually thought of as aiming at systematicity like that. This thought was picked up by A.J. Ayer in the 30s in Language, Truth, and Logic, pushing meta-ethical expressivism, saying, don't think of normative vocabulary specifically focusing on ethical vocabulary. Don't think of it the way G.E. Moore did, in a realistic sort of way. Think of it in terms of the attitude that you're expressing when you approve or disapprove of something. What was caricatured almost from the beginning as the boo-hurrah theory of the use of moral vocabulary. But the development of antidescriptivism from its narrow restriction to logical vocabulary in the Tractatus, the development that mattered most to Sellars was the development of it by Carnap in logical syntax of language. Because Carnap said, in effect, the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus was backed into a corner by seeing the only legitimate thing you could do with non-logical language being picturing of worldly facts, to say that, well, one thing you couldn't talk about was language and its relation to the world, because you can't picture the picturing relation. That committed him to saying that everything he said in the Tractatus was nonsense, that if you really understood it, you wouldn't talk that way. But Carnap says there's another legitimate use of language besides this descriptive picturing use. That's a meta-language, a language that talks about language. In the logical structure of language, he thought that syntactic meta-languages were okay. That was all he had. Tarski later on convinced him that semantic meta-languages were okay. Early Sellars will add pragmatic meta-languages, ones that talk about the use of language. But Carnap said there's one non-descriptive use of language that is logic. We learned that from the Tractatus. But there's another, which is metalinguistic uses. And remember, in that way, he wanted to understand abstract object talk, wanted to understand this apparently fact-stating use. When I say triangularity is a property, wanted to understand that as covertly metalinguistic. His expression was quasi-syntactical. It's really a syntactical remark, but it's disguised as a ground-level factual statement. What the real content of a statement like triangularity is a property is the metalinguistic statement, is triangular is a one-place predicate. You're really talking about language. And this, as I described last time, Sellars saw as a huge expansion of respectable, non-descriptive language, theoretically respectable, non-descriptive language. There was logical language, and there was metalinguistic expressions. And Sellars did, though Carnap never did, conceive the program of understanding all non-descriptive language metalinguistically. That was the epiphany that he had round about 1947, that yes, of course, metalinguistic discourse was okay, and that Carnap had shown us that things could be covertly metalinguistic. They weren't on the surface, but they could be in their depth structure. And that was the way we ought to think about a lot of things. So Sellars drew from Carnap a unified anti-descriptivist strategy. Non-descriptive vocabulary is okay. It's not second class, it's just different if and insofar as we can understand it as metalinguistic. That's at least a paradigm of how we can extend this category. That's not the way Wittgenstein did. He says language is a motley. If you give me any list of all the things you can do with language, all the different kinds of pragmatic force that can be attached to some expression, I'll show you some stuff that you left off the list. There isn't any way to systematize this. One of the things that is of the essence of language is its protean character, the way in which practices morph into other practices, and we add new things that we can do with the language. Okay, so I've been trying to give a picture of what I call a methodological fork in the philosophical road. Descriptivism sees a core linguistic function, and since Descartes, that's been representation, description, fact stating, saying how the world is. And then in a Procrustean way, or anyway, that's how it looks from the anti-descriptivist point of view, you have to say about any way of talking, you have to either be able to fit it into this mold and understand it that way, or you have to say, look, it's just nonsense. It's not really respectable, shouldn't be included in a perspicuous scientific language, the language we do serious thinking and work in. Well, there's lots of things we do with language that it's really hard to just say, well, don't do that anymore. That was the position the logical empiricists were in with respect to logic, really, before the Tractatus taught them how to do better. But if you have that descriptivist strategy, then you're committed to a multifarious variety of ways the world can be, states of affairs, kinds of facts, properties that things can be described as having. So unity on the side of your pragmatics, your account of the language, your semantics is a semantics of representation, but then you've got to find all that stuff that's represented. Or admit that that's just one thing you can do with language, maybe an important thing, and worry about some of these other things, but think about them without being antecedently, theoretically committed to finding facts that you're stating with those declarative sentences, with all of the ontological and especially epistemological problems that come with that descriptivism. So that's the commitment that Sellars is making. That's the way he's seeing the philosophical landscape at this point. Yeah. Comments or questions about that? Okay, here's one more perspective on this same division that I find useful. And it's due to Hugh Price, one of the great pragmatist thinkers of our time. And it's anticipated by Sellars in LRB, where Sellars says, Dewey says, quote, "The concepts and problems of mathematics belong to naturalistic psychology." And Sellars comments on this. Sellars says, "Notice that our suspicious pragmatist did not say, quote, the concepts and problems of mathematics belong to naturalistic psychology. Sellars goes on, "If he had, he clearly would be formulating a descriptivistic philosophy of mathematics. Psychologistic, that would be clear. But what Dewey actually said, Sellars quotes him, there is no aspect of mathematical inquiry as a mode of human behavior which requires a departure from the categories of naturalistic psychology for its interpretation. With this latter statement," Sellars says, "I am in full agreement. It must by no means be confused with the former." Okay. This, I think, is a clear endorsement of the distinction Hugh Price makes between object naturalism and subject naturalism. Now, object naturalism is descriptivism. It's what you get if your semantics is exclusively a representational semantics. If you think that what you do with the language is state facts, what this raises is what Price's Australian compatriot Frank Jackson, in his Oxford Law Lectures, calls location problems. That is, finding for different bits of discourse, finding in the world as natural science describes it, locating in that world truth makers for claims about any kind of discourse that you're going to take seriously. And he says, if and insofar as it looks like the location problem for some bit of discourse is in principle insoluble, then you should condemn that sort of discourse to the flames. So that's looking for the objects that you're talking about, the things you're describing in nature. That's object naturalism. But Hugh Price says there's another way to be a naturalist, and that's to be a naturalist about what you're doing when you're talking that way. And if you can be a subject naturalist about a discursive practice, then rather than facing a potentially insoluble location problem, your solution should be to give up your commitment to giving a representationalist semantics for that bit of discourse. But that doesn't mean you have to be a non-naturalist about it. Now, I think this is enlightening in part because it's something like a master key to understanding the later Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein says, look, you're puzzled about numbers. What is the number 3? Where is it? It's not in space and time. It didn't come into existence. It can't be destroyed. It doesn't exert any forces, not gravity, not electromagnetic forces, strong, weak. How do we interact with them? How can I understand what I'm saying when I say 3 plus 1 is 4, I'm thinking about numbers, these peculiar items. Isn't that puzzling? And Wittgenstein says, well, it's not puzzling how we teach kids to use numerals, how we teach them to count. We can give a perfectly naturalistic account of how kids can learn to count. And in terms of that, how they can learn to add. Now, if we can give a naturalistic account of how you can come into the practice of using numerals, then there's nothing puzzling from a naturalistic point of view about this form of talk. See, yeah, but what about the numbers? See, well, what's puzzling you is your commitment that you have to understand number talk by seeing it as representing numbers, seeing the claim that 3 plus 1 as stating a fact that belongs in at least some capacious box with the fact that there's chickens in the barn. That problem is not with the naturalistic intelligibility of what we're doing in talking. It's that you're applying a bad semantic theory to it. You're applying the theory of the Tractatus to it. That's the problem here. That's the source of your metaphysical puzzlement. So Price says, forget about object naturalism and location problems. What you should be worried about when you're looking at some stretch of discourse is whether you can be a subject naturalist about it. Can you tell a story about that makes intelligible how people could come to talk this way, could learn to talk this way, how the practices are taught, conveyed, and conducted. And if you can do that, then any remaining puzzlements should just make you suspicious about the semantic framework that you're insisting on applying to this. Now, one of the disputes that you and I have had over the years is that he called what Sellars calls antidescriptivism, he called expressivism, generalizing from metaethical expressivism in the way that, in particular, Simon Blackburn did in being a Humean expressivist. Blackburn reads Hume as an expressivist about the 3 M's, meaning, mind, and morals. Talk about those things. A generalized expressivism. And Price was inclined to codify his, I would say, pragmatism is another term for this anti-descriptivist stance, as a global expressivism, saying, look, we should learn that from these considerations that representational semantic paradigm is just broken backed. We shouldn't even apply it to the frog is on the log. Now, I should say that Price came to this view, this radical view in the philosophy of language, from his work in the foundations of physics on the way time variables work in fundamental physics, which he saw as fundamentally non-representational. Nonetheless, and his argument was, you shouldn't apply this semantic framework to anything, because if you do, you're committed to a bifurcation thesis, that one part of the language works in this one way, and the rest of it works and has to be understood in this expressivist way. And he said, and you're not going to be able to draw that line between the bits that should be given a descriptivist representationalist account and the bits that should be given an expressivist account. And my claim was, yes, I endorse the bifurcationist thesis. I think you should be a pragmatist globally, but that part of the job of a pragmatist, one who starts with an account of what you're doing in using the language and moves on to an account of meaning, one of the criteria of adequacy of that is that you be able to give an account of this distinctive discursive practice of fact stating in the narrow sense, descriptive uses. And, well, I'll let Hugh speak for himself on where he got. I think he has moved substantially on this issue by the time of his Descartes lectures. I talk about this at great length in the seminar I gave 3 years ago on anti-representationalism, and all of that's still on my website if you want to go back and look at all the discussion of Price there. But the last thing I wanted to say about the anti-descriptivism debate was a contemporary form of that is Price's notion of subject naturalism as opposed to naturalism. I should say about that, I think it's important that there's two moves here. One move is to insist that some expressions are best understood in a pragmatic metavocabulary, a metavocabulary that's used to talk about not what you're saying, but what you're doing when you talk this way. That's the fundamental pragmatist move, I think. And it's a second optional commitment to say, as Hugh does, and I do not, and I want my pragmatic metavocabulary to be naturalistic, not to appeal to anything that any vocabulary that natural scientists wouldn't be comfortable using. There's at least an intelligible position where you only take the first of those steps and not the second, and see the differences, whether you see normative vocabulary as, in some sense, irreducible, that any pragmatic metavocabulary is going to have to employ normative vocabulary if it's going to be adequate to characterize discursive activity, and that naturalism in a broad sense need not apologize for that. Now, it's been mentioned a couple of times that an alternative to descriptivism, psychologism, object naturalism, what McDowell in Mind and World calls bald naturalism. That's his term for this view. An alternative to that is what McDowell in Mind and World calls rampant Platonism. And that's what Sellars is calling rationalistic a priorism here. And that's to see all the things that there are location problems about as not located in the space and time of natural goings-on, but in some other space accessible only to our minds. A space that we can cognize, but in a non-perceptual way. Have a kind of immediate awareness of it. Now, Sellars' complaints about that picture, the rampant Platonist picture, the rationalist a priorism, is going to be his critique of the myth of the given. And his particular account of abstract object talk, since he thinks that Platonism is about abstract objects and our interaction with them. So we'll start thinking about the myth of the given next week, not this time around. So I'm not going to talk about what's wrong with those views. Okay, so I've been trying to give a big picture to set Sellars' project in, but I think it's an important picture. These are considerations it's important to keep in mind because they come up for almost every philosophically puzzling sort of discourse list from logic on down. I'll also mention that just as it never occurred to Carnap to think of logic in metalinguistic terms, Sellars always puts logic in a special category. It's non-descriptive, but it's not one of these that you tell another story about. He like Carnap, just buys the Tractarian story about logic. And in the end, I think this is a mistake. This is not something I'm going to be arguing here, but it shows up in Sellars never having addressed philosophy of mathematics, or really philosophy of logic, because he thought Wittgenstein had settled that in the Tractatus, but it's a real constraint on his account of abstract object talk that there's a challenge to extend that to mathematical talk generally. And had he extended his lesson to logic, I think this would have worked better. That isn't something I'm going to make a lot of. We have a lot on our plate over the next months. I will mention that John McFarlane cogently criticizes McDowell's reading of Kant on the grounds that McDowell's reading will not extend to an account of Kant's philosophy of mathematics. And McFarlane thinks, and I think there's a lot to this, that the weak spot in McDowell's own views is that he does not have a view about the philosophy of mathematics. That's sort of the other side of the coin of him not knowing what Kant should say about it, as opposed to what he does say about it. Okay. Well, that's the first third of what I hope to get through today. I can see some adjustments are going to be in order. I'm going to start on the Some Reflections on Language Games and break around 2:30 for the break. So Sellars starts off Some Reflections on Language Games, which is constructive in a way in which LRB is diagnostic. He's beginning to think about the use of language and how we should talk about it, and in particular the norms. He says, so it's a rule-guided operation. When you cease recognizing rules, you will walk on all fours. Remember that. Well, what is that? Recognizing rules. We're the creatures who recognize rules. What is that? And one of the options that he considers here is, well, that just means conforming to rules, acting in a way that's regular, a way that could be described just in terms of our dispositions to act. His slogan for that is just conforming to rules. Where is the rule? It's in the person who's describing what you're doing. regula is Latin for rules, and regular means according to a rule, conforming to a rule. But falling objects do that when they accelerate at 32 feet per second. That's a regularity in their behavior. They're conforming to a rule. This is a distinction that Kant makes by talking about the distinction between acting according to a law and acting according to a law or rule, and acting according to a conception of a law because of a representation of the rule that you're acting according to. We act according to conceptions of rules. We're rule governed. Sellars is going to put to one side that descriptivist, reductive picture of norms as in the eye of the beholder, as a matter of mere regularities. I'll talk about what the argument is eventually, but that's not the view that tempts him. That's already put to one side. So he starts off saying, it's acting according to a rule, it's following a rule, it's having the rule in mind, consulting the rule on what you do. But he says there's a powerful objection to this idea. This idea that he says it seems plausible to say that a language is a system of expressions, the use of which is subject to certain rules. And it would seem then that learning to use a language is learning to obey the rules for the use of its expressions. However, as it stands, this thesis is subject to an obvious and devastating refutation. The refutation runs as follows. Thesis: learning to use a language L is learning to obey the rules of L. But a rule which enjoins the doing of an action A is a sentence in a language which contains an expression for A. Hence, a rule which enjoins the using of a linguistic expression E is a sentence in a language which contains an expression for E, an expression of the rule, in other words, a sentence in a meta-language. Consequently, learning to obey the rules for L presupposes the ability to use the meta-language, ML, in which the rules for L are formulated. So that learning to use a language L presupposes having learned to use a language ML. And by the same token, having learned to use ML must presuppose having learned to use a meta-meta language, MML, and so on. But this is impossible. It's a vicious regress. Therefore, the thesis is absurd and must be rejected. So the question is, how can language use be rule-governed? How, in the sense that that we behave as we do because we recognize the rules? That was the phrase he was using. Because we're following rules. How are we to understand our grasp of those rules? Kant had already seen the danger of this regress. There's a famous footnote in the Critique of Pure Reason. And the alternative seems to be, well, you don't need to be aware of the rules. It's enough if your behavior conforms to them. Well, it's enough if you behave regularly. In the first chapter of Making It Explicit, I describe this as the situation that Sellars puts us in here as having two bad alternatives. Regularism that says, well, that talk about norms, that's really in the eye of the beholder. We're really just talking about regularities. And what I call regulism that says, no, the rules are actually active. We're responding to the rules. We're grasping the rules and acting the way we do because of our grasp of the rules. But it seems like there's a regress here. And the only regress stopper that there could be, well, Wittgenstein, when he raises these considerations in the investigations, published a couple years after some reflections on language games, says, well, the regress, as Wittgenstein puts it, it looks as though because following a rule is something that you can do correctly or incorrectly. That's the way he sets up the regress. If we understand the norm of correctness and incorrectness in terms of following a rule, that each rule must be accompanied by an interpretation, a rule for applying it, for saying what's correct or incorrect according to it in particular cases. Interpretation, Deutung is his German word. And he says there's going to be a regress here unless there's a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation, which is not the substitution of one formulation of a rule for another formulation of that rule or of some other rule. I think this is recognizably the same regress that Sellars is talking about here, because that interpretation, that rule that tells you that is a rule for determining correct or incorrect applications of the other rule, well, that would have to be in a meta language because it has to have, the statement of the rule here. Yeah.
Do you think that I guess this is about what you just said, that it's recognizably the same as the one which
I think it is. Here's the way I would put it. Again, this is stepping back to the view from far off, but that's where the large structures become apparent. There's this argumentative structure, the Agrippin trilemma, that we know, I think, from Sextus Empiricus, attributed to Agrippa. And its home language game is epistemology, justification. It says, if the only way to be justified in holding a belief is to justify it, then it seems we've got three alternatives. That's the trilemma. Either when I justify P by giving Q that's a reason for it, well, that justifies P only if Q is justified. So I justify Q by giving R that's a reason for it. And now the trilemma arises when we ask about that process. Each reason that I give can only transmit justification if it has it, and it can only get it by being justified. Either that process goes on forever, and we never get to something that simply is justified and can do this, or we go around in a circle and appeal to some reason that already came up on our list, or there are regress stoppers. There are unjustified justifiers, ones that get their positive justificatory status not by inheriting it from some reason, but they just have it. This is the basic argumentative structure of foundationalist epistemology, which says, look, the circle, the regress, that won't work. Well, there's a semantic version of this Agrippin trilemma, which is one of the keys to understanding Descartes' big move. Descartes gives the first representationalist understanding of awareness. What is it to be aware of something? That's to represent it, to have an appearance of it before the mind. Well, okay, so it's because I have a representing of this represented that I know the represented, that I know the represented. But how do I know the representing? Your theory of awareness says, well, it's a representational theory. I know it by representing it. I have a representing of the representing. If the first representing is my consciousness, the second one is my self-consciousness. But now turn the crank on the Agrippin, on the machinery in the Agrippin trilemma. Either this goes on forever of representings of representings of representings, and we don't actually understand how I can know that the frog is on the log, the represented state of affairs, or it somehow goes around in a circle, or the theory of representational awareness, awareness as representing, has to include a theory of non-representational awareness. There must be something that one can be aware of without having to represent it, namely some representings. That's the view that, as Kant puts it, nothing is better known to the mind than itself. That's the view, the Cartesian view, that on pain of an infinite regress or a circularity that would make awareness unintelligible, there must be something, some states of our mind that we're aware of, not by representing them, but just by having them. Having them must be enough. The things we know of immediately by representing them, that is, with the representing in the middle, mediating it, depends on the intelligibility of some immediate awareness, some non-representational awareness. That's just a semantic application of the same argumentative structure that Agrippa applied to epistemology, but now in semantics. Well, what we're seeing in Sellars and in the later Wittgenstein is that same large argumentative structure applied to normativity. It's saying if you understand norms as rules are norms where you can say what's okay and what's not, norms that say what the difference between what's correct and what's incorrect is, then since norms have to be applied and can be applied correctly or incorrectly, there must be rules for applying the rules, and either that's an infinite regress or a circle, or there's some kind of norm that you can grasp not in a form that requires interpretation or understanding of a rule, but immediately in some act of Platonic intuition, some immediate act of the mind that grasps a rule or a norm. It's the same form of argument, epistemologically having to do with justifying one claim by another, semantically by thinking of awareness in terms of representation of one thing by another, and now in the pragmatics by thinking of a regress of rules, needing a rule for the interpretation of another rule. Now, seeing this common form is really important. Well, is there any sword to cut this Gordian knot? Is there any way to get out of the predicament that generates the Agrippin trilemma in epistemology, in semantics, and in the normative understanding of intentionality? Well, yes, there is. Pragmatism in general gives you a way, but I mean, the slogan for the last case, the case we're caring about here, is there has to be a way of understanding normativity that doesn't either collapse into mere dispositions and regularity or require explicit grasp of a norm in the form of a rule. There has to be some way of making sense of norms implicit in practice or in doings. Now, that should bring to mind Sellars' talk about rules as living in what we do, that they can be described, they can be stated in the form of rules, but that can't be their native form. That can't be the primitive form of normativity. There must be some way in which we can make sense of norms as implicit in practices in what we do. And Sellars is going to give us his sketch of that notion under the heading of pattern governedness. It turns out to be a form of rule governedness. It's clever. It makes a lot of progress. It makes a really important move. In the end, there's issues with it, which he'll address. We'll start talking about that next week. Okay, why don't we take 15 minutes now? I'm making it that we'll come back at 2:40. Okay. So I had suggested an overarching picture where there's two unhappy alternatives for thinking about discursive norms. One being regularism. A norm is in play if you're merely conforming to the norm or to the rule. That is, if you're properly described as satisfying this regularity, then we see a norm in play. That's a descriptivist mistake. And the other is regulism, that says, no, you have to understand the rule and be acting as you are, guided by your understanding of the rule, in order for it to be rule governed and genuinely normative activity. Second large sort of structure saying, in general, we can see the problems, the rule-following problems, the problems with regulism, with that second full-blown picture, being the problems diagnosed, the problems that take the form of the Agrippan trilemma in a distinctive, pragmatic form applying to norms. I suggested there's also a semantic representationalist form that matters for Descartes, and the original epistemological justificatory form that mattered for Agrippa. Now, I didn't say anything about, so I want to come back to the problem with the regulist full-blooded awareness of the rule is required case. I reminded you that one of the Agrippan alternatives there is, well, the rules are present to the mind immediately. We have a rule understanding capacity that is primitive and not to be understood in terms of anything else. That's the rationalistic a priorist, the rampant Platonist alternative in McDowell's Mind and World way of setting these up. Let me briefly say something about the objections to the regularist view, the regularity view. Basically, they are, the norms go missing. It's not really norms, it's just dispositions. This came up within the more recent semantic tradition, teleosemantics, information theoretic semantics. I think Dretsky is the one who sort of named this problem. He called it disjunctivism. If you understand the content of a concept in terms of the dispositions of users, it seems like it's always going to be possible to attribute a disjunctive concept to them according to which they never make a mistake. So if I mistakenly, seeing an Australian echidna for the first time, call it a porcupine, well, did I really have the concept of a porcupine and misapplied it? I was disposed to call this a porcupine. Maybe the concept I mastered really was porcupine or echidna. So he called that disjunctivitis. It's a problem that comes up when you're trying to build norms out of dispositions. And the trouble is to fund a notion of mistake in your dispositions because you always respond the way you're disposed to respond. So there has to be some sort of check on this. And in the literature on Wittgenstein's extensive discussion of this, this has come to be called the gerrymandering problem. Gerrymandering is drawing the lines around a voting district so as to get the results you want. And the claim is, however somebody acts, there's always some regularity that they're acting according to. So in Wittgenstein, somebody's counting 1, 2, 3. When they get up to 100, they go 99, 100, 102, 104. We say, no, you're doing that wrong. Why? Well, you're not continuing the regularity that you were in the first 100. Well, not that regularity, but there's another one where you count by ones for the first 100, by twos for the next 100, and so on. It's just a different regularity, a different norm. How do you, out of all of the regularities that you are instantiating, how do you privilege one of them as the norm that determines that acting according to any of the other regularities would be doing it wrong? And by putting the problem that way, using the notion of privileging one of them, well, that's a normative term. What is it out of all the regularities, all the ways we could describe your behavior, what is it that picks one of them out as setting a normative standard such that doing anything other than conforming to that regularity counts as a mistake? And that's what the disjunctivism problem is. That's what the problem of how to understand going on in the same way in Wittgenstein is. So there's different ways of setting this up, but in general terms, the problem with regularism is that the norms go missing. You can't fund the notion of a mistake with it. This is what leads Crispin Wright to say, oh, well, it's the community regularity. You're not going on in the same way as the rest of us do. Individuals can go right or wrong, but it follows the community just goes, he says. Right? It's not going to be intelligible that the community should make a mistake. And this is basically what McDowell criticizes him for in the piece I put in the available reading, if you want to post a hole on this. And the problem with the full-blooded regulism is that you become a patsy for the Agrippin trilemma and either find regress stoppers in Platonic immediate awareness or you've got an infinite regress or a circle. If one's going, so the challenge is to get between these, to have some notion of a norm being implicit in a practice rather than explicit in a rule, is the way I want to put it. In the appendix to chapter 1 of Making It Explicit, which I put on the website, I complain about Wittgenstein's use of rule in this way, that he uses rule to mean norm, and only some of them are explicit, sayable. I think it's a better practice, better conceptual hygiene, to use rule only for what can be said, for a principle, stateable, call red things red, something like that. That's a rule. Sellars also uses the term more generally. In Sellars' case, that's because Kant does. And so, okay. But Sellars is clear that it's a criterion of adequacy for him on something being rule-governed, genuinely rulish, as he says, his term for normative, I would say, for it genuinely being rulish, that a representation of a rule, a statement of the rule, an explicit statement of the rule, must play a causal role in producing the behavior. Now that's a very strong constraint. And in the end, I want to say he backs away from that, but not in this essay. But what's clever about the story he tells here, his story about pattern-governed behavior, is that he satisfies that criterion of adequacy. So the next thing I want to do is say sort of what that is. Well, yeah, okay. Yeah. Deliberately naive, perhaps.
Yeah, so I'm wondering what exactly is wrong with taking what's wrong with doing graphs? Why can't Slivis state that we understand in infinite number of meta languages? I mean, I guess like my first response, I think everyone thinks it's implausible, is that we just don't have an infinite number of mental states. We never went through a process of learning all these languages. That's physically impossible. But then when you're talking about rules, we are not in the business of describing the world. I'm wondering whether that objection still goes through, or if there's a different objection.
Well, we're not going to get a sort of physically impossible because we're not talking about how it might be implemented in the brain. We're just trying to make it intelligible. So I guess at that point, the question is, well, are these meta-languages innate, or did you acquire them at some point? He's putting this in the framework of language learning. And when we talk next time about acquisition of these things, we'll see that he ends up relaxing his constraints on language learning here. But the way he sets up the regress, you have to learn each meta-language before you learn the language that it's a meta-language for. Before. Because it's the rule in the meta-language that tells you how to understand any statement, including a statement of a rule, in the language for which it's a meta-language. So there's a temporal regress involved here. You can't understand each step unless you already temporally beforehand understood the other. Now, maybe you're pointing to a place where pressure could be put on the argument. Need that be temporally before? Could we make sense of acquiring all of them at once? But if we reject the idea of an innate rule grasping capacity, and I don't think that's just a silly view. Chomsky thinks that. He still thinks that language would be unlearnable if we didn't have an innate rule understanding capacity that extended to grammatical rules. So transcendental deduction of that capacity in Chomsky, not the feature of his thought that has been most popular, but that's his story and he's sticking to it. So, there may be some go to that, but I think this is how it's working for Sellars in the Wittgensteinian version of it. You need, for each rule, you need to have another rule. So you would need to be contemplating that infinite set of rules for applying the other rules, for applying the other rules. If you're, depends on what your theory of mind is like, but that's at least an issue. Okay. Sellars says, we're talking about a rule-governed practice. That's what we want to make sense of. What's unintelligible is that each practitioner should be following a rule whenever they make a claim. That's unintelligible because of the regress. But rules or norms that we consult in deliberation, in my following the rule, that's only one way in which rules can show up in a practice. That's the first personal way, where I'm the doctor making a difficult clinical decision, and I'm remind myself of the of Hippocrates' principle: first, do no harm. Don't do it unless you can be sure you won't do more harm than good by doing it. Okay, how does that rule help me in the situation that I'm in? Well, it's as much help as it is, but that's the sort of thing you do. You have a bunch of rules, and you try and apply them. But that is by no means the only way in which norms live in our practices. They also live in our assessments of our behavior and of other people's behavior as correct or incorrect. In addition to that first person use of norms or rules in deliberation, in the context of deliberation, there's also appeal to norms or rules in the second or third person context of assessment and evaluation. And that's particularly important to remember when you think about actual language learning, where you're teaching the child the different colors, there's the differently colored pieces of candy, and if they utter the right noise, they get that piece of candy. If they call that piece of candy purple, they get the purple candy, and learn to respond to purple things by saying purple. This is supervised learning, so the teacher is assessing what they do as correct or incorrect and shaping their behavior accordingly. Peircean evolution of a habit by selective process, but this is guided learning, selection, by the teacher assessing correctness or incorrectness and bringing the young one into conformity to have the regularity, to exhibit the regularity, to conform to the regularity. And now suppose there's a borderline case. Again, we're looking at pictures in the picture book, and there's a robin's egg blue patch, and the child says blue. Well, is that blue or is it actually green? Was that a mistake? Was that, what should I say about that? No, you should only call blue things blue, and that's not blue. So stick, not carrot, for that. In hard cases, the teacher, and now think about the clinical teacher, the doctor on rounds, faced with a difficult case, the teacher's assessment is guided by an explicit statement of a norm, or at least they have that. They already have mastered the concept that's being taught. They can formulate a rule like that, even a rule like call red things red, which could not be the way the infant mind learns. In a later essay, Sellars describes this Augustinian fantasy of the infant mind saying, oh, there's one. Yes, that looks like the other one. Yeah, there's another one. By the powerful methods of inductive logic taught to us by John Stuart Mill, that must be what mother means by red. That's his picture of sort of the alternative picture. He's already got the awareness of this. He doesn't have the rule, call red things red. He's getting a habit. He doesn't have a norm yet. He gets a habit. His behavior shaped in this way. But if we want to give an explanation of why, say now the 5-year-old who's a master of color vocabulary, why he conforms to the norm, why he exhibits this regularity. If we look upstream in the causal process that shaped his behavior, we'll see representations of the rules on the part of his teacher. In the index case, where this teacher actually consulted the rule, again, you might think about the tennis coach who says, no, I don't know any tennis rules, but anyway, what they're trying to get somebody to do. But in any case, the teacher could. They have mastered the concepts. They're in a position to be aware, to understand an explicit expression of the rule. So Sellars says, he goes through his notion of pattern governed, where later generations or later on in the learning process, you exhibit this regularity because it's a regularity. This is the bee dances story that he's telling. But when he gets to talking about real rule governedness, the point is it can be, you can act as you do because of the rule, not because you can grasp the rule, but because the habit you acquired was selected by somebody who was acting according to the rule which they understood. So this is the response in Sellars' response in Some Reflections on Language Games. And I think it's a commentary, sad commentary, really, on the sociology of our discipline, that this never got discussed in the 80s and 90s, the heyday of the rule-following considerations in the wake of Kripke's book. People took the problem of rule-following to be exclusively first-personal context of deliberation and didn't make this social move that says, well, there's also assessment, and this historical move to say, well, there's also the generational shift. Now, this Some Reflections on Language Games is first the impetus and then something like the Bible that Sellars' last Yale Ph.D. student, Ruth Millikan, took as the impetus for her work. She took this idea of selection of regularities over time as a way of baking normative bread out of non-normative ingredients, taking dispositions, using a dispositional metavocabulary, appealing to selectional mechanisms to privilege some regularities over others so that she could define the proper function of a heart, which, let's say, all proper functioning hearts pump blood, but they also make a lub-dub noise. Those two regularities are both exhibited by well-functioning hearts, but she says, but the proper function, a normative notion now, of the heart is to pump blood, because the explanation for why we have hearts goes back to generations where their hearts pumped blood. If they had not made the noise but pumped blood, we would still have hearts that pump blood. That counterfactual says it was the blood pumping that was responsible for selecting this regularity over the generations, now not by learning but by evolution in that paradigmatic case. That's how one of the regularities gets privileged as setting a norm. And she takes that basic case as the core idea of her book, whose title is Language, Thought, and Other Biological Categories. Because she, as a good Sellars student, took it as a criterion of adequacy of giving an account of language, which is what 90% of the book is about, that you make sense of the norms that govern the use of language. But as a good scientific naturalist, she wanted to fund that normative talk using, well, Peircean pragmatist habit and disposition talk, and did so, just for those of you who may not be familiar with the details of the Millikan, the way selectional mechanisms can make a distinction, an intentional with an S distinction. So where two properties are coextensional, they're true of the same things, like the hearts that go lub-dub and the hearts that pump blood. But we want to make an intentional distinction and say, nonetheless, one of them is privileged. This is where we're going to get the norms from. We can distinguish what's selected and what's selected for. So suppose you have a bunch of large black marbles and small white marbles, and you run them down a board that has medium-sized holes in it, and all and only the white marbles are selected, fall through, and all and only the small marbles are selected, they fall through. So what's selected is all the small marbles and all the white marbles. So the property of being small and the property of being colored white, they're coextensive in these marbles. Both were selected, but only one was selected for. The size being small was selected for, because if you had put a small black marble in, it would have gone through. It would have been selected. Where if you'd put a large white marble through, it would not have been selected. So that dispositional fact enables, funds a distinction between what's selected, which is an extensional matter, and what's selected for. Only one of those coextensional properties is selected for. And that's a strategy for funding anyway norm-like distinctions, appealing only to modal, alethic modal properties. And that basic idea, that's the idea of contemporary teleosemantics, of which Millikan's account is by far the most sophisticated and satisfying. And that's a Peircean way of responding to Sellars' call that we're not creatures of habits, we're creatures of rules. Well, both, really, if you can understand the rules in terms of habits. That's what Millikan wants to do. And that's what she properly sees Sellars wanting to do here. Now, Sellars moved away from this view. By the time of EPM, he already had a different account. It's not that he thought that anything he said here was wrong, but he came to take more seriously the regress that's implicit in his account. What regress is that? Well, it's a regress of generations, right? As long as if you've already got an up and running discursive enterprise that has teachers in it who understand the language and rules written in it, then this is a story about how that can be passed on, how it can be conferred on, that rule governedness can be passed on to the next generation. But how does it all get off the ground? Well, you could ask Millikan the same question about those good hearts, right? And indeed, Darwin was asked questions like that, but there are selectional things to say about it. And because he only really gives us the apparatus in EPM, I'm going to wait to say just how he tells that story. I will say that Sellars would entirely approve of a bit of linguistic punctiliousness that's common in contemporary linguistics discourse. reacting to Chomskyan excesses, you won't find non-Chomskyan linguists, by and large, talking about language learning anymore. They talk about the young ones coming into the language, coming to participate in the practices that are always already up and running. Well, I'll have more to say about that on Sellars' behalf next time. You won't be enlightened by the slogan I'm about to repeat, but I think it's worth repeating anyway. If you ask John McDowell about where these discursive practices come from, he cites Wittgenstein and says, the light dawns slowly over the whole. I mean, in the end, I think that's exactly what one should say. I just don't think, in spite of its invocation of the light dawning, that it's very illuminating about how it actually works. So I'll talk about that more tomorrow. Okay, so all of that is trying to give you the large structure of sort of what's the issues in some reflections on language games, and what's the move that Sellars is making that I believe has not sufficiently been appreciated. Okay. That leaves me very little time to talk about inference and meaning, the other essay. So let me hit the high points, and we'll, with the consolation that we'll rehearse these points again anyway when we read the counterfactuals, dispositions, and causal modalities treatment of alethic modal expressions. So there's three moves that get made here. I think they're all of equal importance, really, but we got to get the first one. And here, the key passage is from that CDCM essay. He says, "It's only because the expressions in terms of which we describe objects locate these objects in a space of implications that they describe at all rather than merely label." So now we're talking about description, the one that's going to matter for science. He says, well, there's a distinction between mere labeling and genuine describing. And this is absolutely important if we think about that early modern way of thinking about awareness, about concepts, about judgment in terms of classification, where maybe locus classicus is a Port Royal logic. You start with a classification of concepts, singular and general, and on that basis that's your doctrine of concepts. On that basis you get a doctrine of statements, forms of judgment, which is a way of classifying forms of classification. So classifying something particular under something general is one kind of statement, one kind of classification. Socrates is a man. Classifying one thing as a subclass of another. All men are mortal. That's another kind of classification. Your doctrine of statements classifies forms of conceptual classification. And then your doctrine of inferences or syllogisms classifies movements from statements to statements. You say, well, if you move from an A statement and an A statement to an A statement is a subclassification statement. That's a syllogism in Barbara. All men are mortal, all mortal things die, so all men die. That's a classification of the inference in terms of the classifications of the statements. That isn't getting to the essence of describing anything yet for Sellars, at any rate, not until the very end. Because classifying things, well, this is going to come under the heading of merely labeling. That's what happens when a chunk of iron classifies its environment or labels its environment as a wet one or a dry one by rusting in some of them and not in others. It's sorting them all right. There's a classification, but there's nothing conceptual going on. It's not describing its environment as wet or dry by rusting or not rusting. What more is needed for a description? Well, location in a space of implications, he says. Think about labeling with real labels. So suppose somebody has, I'm helping somebody clear out their garage, and they've labeled all the boxes, and I look at them, and some of them are labeled red, and some of them are labeled with green, and some of them are labeled with yellow. Okay, they're all labeled. Are those descriptions of them? Well, Sellars says not until you know what they mean. That is, not until you know what follows from its being red, green, or yellow. If you tell me, oh, the green ones are to be loaded in the truck, the red ones are to be put out for the trash, and the yellow ones, you've got to get my mother-in-law and ask her what to do about them. I don't dare do anything with those. That's what it means. That's what follows from it being classified this way. Okay, at that point, you have more than mere labels. You have descriptions. You're saying something when you put that label on it because something follows from it. It's not just sorting things upstream. It has significance downstream. Or suppose I'm introducing you to the concept of things that are agreeable. And I say, well, the microphone is agreeable, but the camera isn't. The computer is, but the table isn't. It's a fundamental fact of, for instance, art history that if I went on with that enough, you would actually sort of catch on to it and be able to sort things into agreeable and non-agreeable things. This is how various genre categories turn out to work. This is Goodman's thought in Languages of Art. But suppose I gave you an infallible agreeableness tester, that whenever you pointed it at something, it lit up, if and only if it was agreeable. Well, you could label things as agreeable, all right. Is that a description of things? Well, not unless you know what follows from labeling it that way. That's an essential element of it's being conceptually contentful, that classification or response. That's Sellars' inferentialist idea about the conceptual. So one of his slogans is, grasp of a concept is always mastery of the use of a word. Well, mastery of the use, knowing what follows from it and what doesn't, locating it in that space of implications. The difference between the parrot that can respond to red things by saying, rock, that's red. That is, by making that noise. And me, when I say that, maybe using the same noise, The difference is that it's just labeling with a response, with this noise. It doesn't mean anything to the parrot, that noise. Whereas when I say that's red, I'm taking up a position in the space of reasons, where certain things follow from it, would be evidence for it and against it, and so on. That is, for me, it's a description, as it isn't for the parrot. So Sellars has, I think, a nicely constructed essay here. He considers 6 alternatives as to how you might think about these connections, and argues, no, we need full-blown inferential connections in order to have concepts. The flaw in the essay is he really assumes you have a black belt in Carnap in order to read it. You better know what Carnap said about P rules and L rules and so on in order to do it. But the position he's after is that the use of a word that you need to master in order to count as understanding it is its position in the space of implications. You need to know what follows from applying this description, that it's what other descriptions follow, what ones it rules out. So if this monochromatic spot is red, you need to know that it's not green, but you need to know that it follows that it's colored. You need to know that if it's crimson, then it is red. It needs to be situated in this space. That's what grasping the concept is. That's his inferentialist semantic idea. And that's an idea that I've basically spent 40 years trying to work out and develop. For Sellars, it was important, and I mean, we'll trace this sort of for the rest of the course, that this is a horizontal fundamental semantic understanding. It's understanding the concept in terms of its relation to other concepts, not in terms of what it represents in the world. And on the one hand, this adds tremendous flexibility to his account of concepts. Concepts where you don't know what they represent. You can still talk about the inferential role that they play, and so about the meaning of them while you're inquiring whether this concept represents something. So I'm not, at the moment, claiming this is true or right, though I do claim it's true and right. And I'm certainly not asking you to believe it at this point. I'm asking you to understand the view that I'm attributing to Sellars. That's the first step, that the conceptual content of a description at least includes its situation in a space of implications, what he'll otherwise call a space of reasons. Many of you may know that this seminar room is traditionally called the space of reasons, because Sellars taught in it, and we teach about him in it. That's the first point in this essay. The second point is that those implications are subjunctively robust implications, or at least include subjunctively robust implications. If we think about it pragmatically, the claim is that describing things, saying how they are, and explaining why they are that way are two sides of one coin pragmatically. Any set of practices that includes describing things has to include explaining the applicability of some descriptions in terms of the applicability of others. That's typically what you're doing when you say, well, the streets are wet outside. I've described the streets out there. Well, where is that in the space of implications? How can I justify that claim? Well, it's been raining. If it had been raining, they would be wet. It has been raining, so they will be wet. I can explain the applicability of the description. The streets are wet, even though I can't see the streets from here, by appeal to the applicability of the description. It's raining, which I can see. Well, I could back when it was raining an hour or two ago. The descriptive and explanatory resources of the language advance hand in hand, Sellars says, in the CDC MSA, not here. The connection, those implications connecting one description with another, support counterfactual reasoning. If this description were to apply, so would this other one. Had this description applied, this other one would have. You can explain the applicability of this description in terms of the other. It follows from this, and this is the third point I want to make as we finish up, one half of what I call the Kant-Sellars thesis about modality, that there are no modally insulated empirical properties or descriptions on the side of the language. There are no properties you can attribute to something that don't have as necessary conditions of their applicability claims about what would happen if. So, I say the cube is made of wood. And you say, well, there's nothing modal about that. I say, well, it can't be wood unless if you were to raise it to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, it would burn. It can't be a cube unless if you counted its vertices, you would get 8. Every empirical property has necessary conditions that are subjunctively robust conditionals. Now again, I'm putting this claim out there. We'll look at it again when we discuss him on modal properties. But let me point out one consequence of this. There's a naive way of thinking about possible world semantics that says, really possible world semantics explains alethic modal expressions quantificationally in terms of non-modal expressions. Because we can specify each possible world in terms of non-modal expressions in the sense of expressions whose applicability doesn't depend on what's true in any other world. We just say what's true in this world using the ordinary non-modal expressions that Hume understood. And now we do need to step back and let me tell you that there is more than one of these worlds, and we can describe each of them in these non-modal terms, and they have accessibility relations between them. And to say that something has a modal property is possible in one world just says that it's accessibly related to something else that has that non-modal property in that world. And it's necessary if it has that non-modal property in all the accessible worlds. Don't you see? Well, yes, but one of those non-modal properties that you said this had here was that the coin is made of copper in this world. Maybe it's made in aluminum in the other world, but it's made of copper here. But it isn't copper unless it's true of it that if you heated it to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, it would melt. If that's not true of it, it's not copper. If it doesn't have that modal property, then it's not copper in this world. There are no properties, no empirical properties that can have in this world that don't have necessary conditions that involve statements about other worlds, if that's the way you're understanding the modal involvements of them. And that means that naive Lewisian picture is fundamentally broken back. That picture, that way of understanding modality. It's not to say there's nothing useful about it, but it's not useful because it explains modal properties quantificationally in terms of non-modal ones, because there are no non-modal properties, at least not the empirical ones. Now again, I don't expect you to believe that on the basis of what I've said here. I mean to be showing that the stakes are high for these claims he's making about the nature of concepts and the inferential involvements of the concepts. If he's right, if this inferentialist line he's taking is right, if it's a necessary condition of being descriptively contentful that you're situated in the descriptive property is situated in a space of implications, and that those implications must include subjunctively robust ones, then that has consequences for how we think about metaphysics, not just semantics. In particular, it has consequences for how we think about alethic modality. So, lots of deep and important ideas in this that he broaches and introduces in Inference and Meaning that we'll see developing in later work. Okay, well, keep checking the website. You see I fiddle with it, trying to sort of add stuff to it each time. And I'll see you next week.